All right, we left off talking about the French and Indian War and the early phases of the war, which consisted of a series of French victories, namely along the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. Really, this divide between French Canada and the British colonies. And this was due to the fact that the French had superior advantages in this area thanks to their centrally located and organized military around the Great Lakes and their alliances with the Native American tribes in this area. So the first 4 years of the war, it was really looking bad for the British. Also, a lot of the British generals, as well as the British military, were ill-equipped and incompetent. And they did not start off this war well, and they lost a bunch of forts. They lost Fort Oswego, Fort Niagara, Fort Ticonderoga, Fort George. These were all formerly British forts that had been taken over by the French. And by 1758, it was looking like the British mainland, the colonies themselves, were going to be invaded at the hands of the French. So now let's look at the turning of the tide of the war, and we're going to really look at two factors here. Prime Minister William Pitt and his actions and his policies that helped the British turn the tide of this war, and then the decisive Battle of Quebec. So this is Prime Minister William Pitt. He was elected Prime Minister in 1758, namely because the war was going poorly for Great Britain, and he had a lot of good ideas on how to turn the tide of war and how to get Great Britain to win. And basically, his first idea was to fire all of the incompetent generals leading armies in North America. He basically wanted to replace the generals that were losing battles with people like himself, people who were organized, people who were motivated, people who were capable. He wanted generalship to be based on merit. Previous generals in the New World were appointed not by the Prime Minister, but were appointed by the King, and they were appointed not because of their merit, but basically because they were loyal to the King, or because they knew a member of the royal family or were friends with the King. So these generals were not competent. So William Pitt is basically going to get rid of all these incompetent generals and replace them with more capable, organized, and motivated generals. The second policy and action that he's going to take is going to be related to finances. William Pitt realized that the British could vastly outspend the French in this war, and he began to pump millions and millions of dollars into the war effort through that efficient system of British taxation and eventually through borrowing. So the first thing that William Pitt did is he raised domestic taxes on individuals living in Great Britain. Now, he could only do this to a point. Once taxes got too high in Great Britain, he began to borrow money from other individuals. He began to borrow money from wealthy private citizens and foreign banks. And he is going to spend so much money over the course of this war that the English national debt will more than double in the last few years of this war. This is ultimately going to be a reason that will lead down the road to the taxation of the colonies and eventually the American Revolution. But it was because he could pump this vast amount of money and resources into the British war effort that by 1759, the tide had begun to turn. So by 1759, a lot of the setbacks that the British faced in the early years began to be countered, and they were gaining territory. And it became time to invade Canada and eventually now to take the war to the French and to take an offensive strategy to bring this war to a close. And this is going to lead to the Battle of Quebec, which is the most decisive battle in this war. Now, if you take a look here, This is Quebec. Now, Quebec was an early fort that was settled, an early settlement point of the French going all the way back to 1608. And you're going to see later what the fort looks like at Quebec. It is quite fortified, but it's important because if you look at the location of Quebec, if you take Quebec, you can choke off the entire St. Lawrence River and essentially blockade the French and prevent them from getting any military supplies. Because the French are located around the Great Lakes and the interior of North America. So if you control this waterway, you control basically all of the French access to materials that will help them fight the war. Furthermore, at the same time, the British are also moving inland from the colonial mainland and retaking those forts that were taken over in the early years of the war by the French. So, a large contingent of British troops, 4,500 British troops, set sail from Boston, making their way around Nova Scotia, through the Gulf of Lawrence, under the command of John Wolfe, down the St. Lawrence River, with the intention of landing at Quebec and taking this fort. Now, this is a postcard of what the fort would have looked like at 1759. And as you can see, this fort sits up on the high bluffs overlooking the St. Lawrence River. It's very fortified. It's very formidable. And the strategy that the British are going to need to do if they're going to take this fort is to get around the fort and find a way to get up over the high bluffs behind the fort. So in order for the British to take this fort, the English are going to have to find a way around, through the St. Lawrence River, around this fort, and are going to have to find a path under the cover of nightfall, up the bluffs, and to get around this fort. So within a few days, the British find a way up the bluff and around the fort. And you can see the British here sailing around the fort and trying to find a path and then climbing up the bluff. Now, once they find the paths leading up the bluff, the landing started en masse, and it was in about 1 day or so that all 4,500 British regular troops had made it up the bluff and behind the fort. And here you can see them, some artist depictions of British soldiers climbing up the rocky, steep bluffs. I believe they were like 50 meters high. And the goal here, once they arrived and were behind the actual fort at Quebec, you can see the goal here was to cut off the soldiers, the French soldiers that were stationed at the fort in Quebec, from any of the surrounding cities, and to also cut them off from the St. Lawrence River, essentially forcing the French soldiers to come out of the fort and fight the British in the open field. And that's exactly what happened. The British cut off the French soldiers at the fort at Quebec. The French soldiers left the fort and confronted the British in the open field. This open field is known as the Plains of Abraham, and this battle is sometimes known as the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and it was a bloody battle. It was violent. Lots of people died. It was a huge battle, a nasty battle, a bloody battle. In fact, both commanders died during this battle. Commander John Wolfe of the British was shot 3 times and killed in the first day of fighting, and the French commander Montcalm was shot and killed and died well on retreat. But when it was all said and done, the British won this battle, and Quebec surrendered, and fell into the hands of the British. This was a decisive battle and really marked the beginning of the end of the war for the French. It was at the Battle of Quebec where you can say confidently that the French lost the French and Indian War. Now, back in this day, wars were ended with formal treaties, and the Treaty of Paris is going to be the treaty that brings about the formal end of this war. Let's take a little look at the conditions of the Treaty of Paris. So here on the left, you have a map of the territorial land holdings before the war. You can see that the French have the Louisiana Territory, the Great Lakes region into Canada, and the English have the eastern seaboard, some of Canada. You'll notice after the war, the French are eliminated. The Treaty of Paris formally eliminates all French land holdings in North America. Before the war came to an end, the French, knowing that they were going to lose this war, ceded the Louisiana Territory, basically all that territory west of the Mississippi River, to Spain, simply to keep it out of the hands of the British. So the Spanish get the Louisiana Territory and the English get the rest. They get the Great Lakes region, Canada, and of course the places where they already were. This is the complete elimination of France from North America. Let's take a look now at the legacies and significance of the French and Indian War. First significance, Great Britain now has control of most of North America. What does that mean for France? France is effectively eliminated from the North American continent. What is the long-term impact of this on the development of North America? Well, the British people are going to be free to expand unchecked by any foreign European power, minus the Spanish, and that really won't be much of an issue. English civilization is going to take dominant root in North America. The British are going to expand without any counterbalance to what they want in North America. And that also spells bad news for a lot of the Native American tribes, because the English overall had harsher relationships with the Native American tribes compared to the French, and the English were really interested in settling permanently in North America, whereas the French were there for trade. So it's going to have some disastrous impacts over the course of our history for the Native American tribes. But the second reason, and really the more important reason for this course, is that the French and Indian War paves the way for the American Revolution. Wars cost a lot of money, and under the policies of William Pitt, England spent millions and millions of dollars fighting this war, and England is in heavy debt to foreign banks, to private individuals, and many of the English people living in Great Britain are highly taxed. Over the course of this war, England's national debt more than doubles. And this is going to lead to the taxation of the colonists in North America. Not just for this war debt, but now England has more land to administer and to govern. They have all the land of the Great Lakes, all the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. And that land is going to need to be patrolled now by British troops. And to station British troops in North America is also going to cost money. So this war paves the road to revolution in America by creating a basis of necessary taxation of the English colonists. Now, the English colonists are going to reject this taxation policy because they are used to a policy of salutary neglect, namely that they should be allowed to tax and govern themselves by their own consent. So England is going to start paying more attention to what's happening in North America, taking more control over their finances, and this will ultimately lead to revolution.